Hi there, my name is Ben Wellington, and I am, of all things, I wear a couple hats, but one thing I am happens to be a blogger. And today I'm going to tell you about my experience basically as a citizen of New York who has a full-time job but then became interested in civic engagement through data. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the changes I pushed to make happen in the city, and then we are going to introduce an amazing panel of people who actually do this stuff professionally, unlike me, and I'm going to learn a ton from them, and we all are as well. So let me get started and talk a little about context here. Open data, right, is this notion that the data that government creates or collects is public. It's all of our data, right? And imagine a world where all data were public unless there was a reason for it not to be. Imagine in a corporation if you could access any data you wanted unless there's a reason for it not to be, right? And you can have security reasons, you can have privacy reasons, there's lots of reasons. But imagine if there was no good reason, the default was public. That's what open data aspires to be. Here in New York, I believe it was 2012 where Mayor Bloomberg passed the open data legislation. And with that, he basically said, across city government, agencies use data, develop policy, implement programs, and track performance. And each month, our administration shares more and more of this data with the public at large, catalyzing the creativity, intellect, and enterprising spirit of computer programmers to build tools that help us all improve our lives. And this is interesting, right? This is the government view of open data. Let's get the computer programmers to build us apps, and then the apps will save the world, and then we're done, right? The reality is, open data is not about computer programmers, though government seems to always think it is, right? What if we all had access to this data? What if we could all use it for ourselves to change policy, to make recommendations, to really just prove things that you really believe about the city? And you don't need to be a programmer. That's what I'm gonna show you some examples of some sort of simpler stuff. So in the old world, we got charts and graphs from our city agencies. You know, somebody somewhere decided, you know, every chart or graph you ever see is a narrative, right? Every graph you've ever seen is somebody's narrative by definition. Somebody's taken raw data and decided what to put in the graph, and they're pushing a narrative. And that's fine, it's not malicious, but it's a narrative. But these are taxis, these are cars. We can ask an infinite number of questions about everything in our city, literally. So these are taxis, and instead of counting them, I wanted to know, hey, they're driving around all day. When is rush hour in New York City? So instead of counting, these things have GPS recorders. What if we recorded where they were at all times? We could see when they dropped off, when they picked up, do a little high school algebra or math or physics, and distance equals rate times time. We could figure out the average speed of every taxi in New York, and we could figure out rush hour. Let's do it. So here we are, New York City, rush hour. Turns out the fastest time in New York to drive is 5:18 in the morning. So set your clocks. Things get really bad really quickly, and by 8:30, the average taxi in New York is traveling 11.5 miles an hour, and it turns out there's no rush hour in New York, just rush day, right? If you live here, you know that. It's until 6:30, our cabs are going the exact same speed. They're all going about 11.5 miles an hour all day. These are the kind of questions we can start to ask. These are not the charts and graphs our city agencies are creating for us, always. Sometimes they are, sometimes we have to ask the questions. With access to data, we ask our own questions, we get our own narratives. Some things you can ask are silly, like I was wondering where tourists go in New York. And I didn't know how to measure that. One way is, where do people not from New York get parking tickets? Okay, so I took the percent of tickets given to non-New Yorkers in every neighborhood, and you can see they tend to cluster in Manhattan. We can do this state by state. People in New Jersey don't cross the East River. They come in, they stop in Manhattan, they don't visit Brooklyn. I know, I live there. People from Connecticut get tickets in the north of the city, coming in from our north. My favorite is people from California seem to get parking tickets only in the hippest parts of Brooklyn. Williamsburg, Greenpoint. You can literally measure how cool a state is by its parking ticket footprint in New York. Now, I'm not saying this is important, but I'm saying start to think outside the box. This is not something that our city government would ever ask itself. But we can ask all these questions. They can get more serious too. You know, I assume that most a robbery is somebody coming to you taking something by force, right? I've always assumed that a robbery most likely would happen in the middle of the night, right? You're always kind of dangerous. Actually, I have a mic, I can walk. All right, I didn't realize. I have a mic on, I can move. This shows actually when most robberies happen in New York City throughout the day. And what do you see? A bump at 3 p.m. This is astounding to me. This is new data. Up until a few years ago, the only access to crime data we had in New York was monthly counts per precinct. Monthly counts per precinct. Now we have individual data. Every crime is a row in a data set. We can ask anything we want. For the first time, I can understand when is the time when the most robberies happen, right? And what do we see? Well, turns out that it's only on school days at 3 p.m. where this bump happens. And this is kind of sad, right? I had this idea, and it turned out to be right. The red line is weekdays where kids are not in school. The blue line is weekdays where kids are in school. and the green line is weekends. So on weekends, yes, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., not a good time to be out. But on weekdays, it turns out that most robberies happen right when our kids get out of school here in New York. Now, let's take a moment, think about that. What does that mean for after-school programming? Can we measure this on a neighborhood-by-neighborhood level? Can we deploy resources appropriately? Finally, we can ask these questions, which we couldn't ask before when we got our PDF file with a number, right? This is powerful. I started to ask other questions of the city. Here in New York, we rate our restaurants A, B, and C. Every restaurant gets a letter grade in their window. And it turns out if you get these violations, oh, I see this is not hot enough, this is not cold enough, your soap is not here, and each of these violations is 1 or 2 points, and they add up, okay? If you get 13 or less points, great, you get an A in your window. If you get 14 to 26, B in your window. If you get 27 or higher, C, or you're in trouble if it gets too high, right? So I decided to just count how many restaurants in the city have each rating. What I'm showing you here is the green are our A's, okay? At 13, what do you notice? A giant drop as soon as we go to 14. How are all these restaurants so good that they can only get 13 points and not 14 points? Doesn't make sense, does it? What's happening? Well, our inspectors understand the consequences of having a big B in the window, and they're turning a blind eye, probably. I can't prove that. But we can see this for the first time using open data. I wrote about this, and the Department of Health responded. Inspectors are not instructed to offer leniency, just to cite what they see. The final score is based on the extent of the violation the inspector observed. So they didn't really say anything useful. They just kind of put out this quote. And it turns out that, why is this a problem? Because we all have biases. And if we let people, I have some follow-up work that I'm going to publish, which shows that depending on the ethnicity of the food, you see different grade inflation happening, right? And this is not because people are evil, but because we all have our own intrinsic biases and it's hard to control for. So we should really be careful. By the way, I can't see which inspectors have this chart, but the Department of Health can run that chart on every inspector, and they can tell you right away who's inflating grades, right? It should be very clear. And they can take action. They haven't. I showed this to them 5 years ago. Today, the chart looks identical, but maybe one day they will address that issue. Our taxis in New York City, when you drive, when you get out of the taxi, it says, hey, do you want to tip 20, 25, or 30%? Those are your 3 options. You can hit other. Most people seem to hit 20%, but did you ever stop and think 20% of what? I hadn't really, and it turns out that it depended on the manufacturer of the computer in the back of your cab. Half our fleet was programmed by Creative Mobile Technologies. It was 20% of your toll, your tax, any surcharges by the MTA, and your fare, right? 20% on Verifone cabs, just 20% of your fare. So drivers who did the exact same trip who were driving Creative Mobile Technology cabs were making $300 to $400 more a year just because a software developer had decided a different tipping algorithm in the back of that cab. And this is a very highly regulated industry if you know anything about taxis in New York. And yet no one had noticed this until this data became public. And it first became public, by the way, because one of our panelists actually filed a Freedom of Information request and put it out on the internet. And once it was out, they said, all right, well, it's out. And we'll talk about that maybe in a little bit. That's Chris Wong, who you'll see in a minute. The TLC said, we appreciate the work that went into this analysis, and we're giving it a thorough read. My favorite government response to anything I've ever done. I really love this one. I loved it. And a week later, they reprogrammed half the fleet of cabs in New York City. Today, we all tip on top of tolls and taxes. But at least it's equitable. At least it's equitable. I'll skip this one. We have our city budget. Do you realize that our budget until a year or two ago was only available in PDF form? And it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. And not just to us, not just to the public, to the legislators. The people who vote on our budget were given giant PDF or printed copies and had to vote on this budget with billions of dollars. And they couldn't analyze it. They can't ask questions. So the first time this was available, I decided I'm just going to find the most expensive thing the NYPD spends money on. I was just curious. And what I found is the protection of foreign missions cost $800 million. Now this was a red flag, $800 million for the protection. Now it was more than school safety, transit, obviously a mistake of some sort, right? And it turns out, oh, it was a typo. But it was a typo that made it through the entire budget process, meaning everyone has their own projects, but who's looking at the big picture? Without public data, nobody sometimes. The response from the city here is though it appears in the budget documents made public, it does not affect actual operations or monetary allocations, right? That's true because it was just a typo that it actually was something else, but we approve this budget. These are the things that we need to fix, and open data can go a long way. I'll show you 2 more examples, and then I'm going to bring in the actual professionals here instead of the hobbyists. One is, these are fire hydrants in New York City, and not just any fire hydrants, these are the fire hydrants that are bringing in the most revenue because people park too close to them, right? Every fire hydrant has a revenue, right? Every fire hydrant has revenue. So I figured, well, let's let's measure outliers. Let's just take, so these are the top 250 grossing hydrants. We see, like, for example, the Upper East Side, they love ticketing fire hydrants. Good to know. I don't live up there, but fascinating. More interesting are these two hydrants on the Lower East Side, which together are making over $55,000 a year just being fire hydrants. They're making more than minimum wage being fire hydrants, right? Something is wrong. And this is not the kind of thing that our agencies have time to look at, or, you know, who's watching this stuff, right? It's not that by the way, they're very smart people. They do a lot of things, but who's watching, right? And I don't think they're malicious. I don't think this is intentional. No, I went and looked at the spot, and it turned out that it was a hydrant with a little lane there, and people thought it's okay to park there. There's like a bike lane between my car and the hydrant, and by the way, the DOT painted a parking spot. Seems reasonable, right? Turns out that's not a bike lane. It's called a curb extension, which makes it not legal to park there, but you would never know it because people bike on it all day. And if you go through Google Maps, you'll see parking tickets on everyone's windshield, like through the years. You can actually see the parking tickets. So I wrote about this. The Department of Transportation said, while the DOT has not received any complaints, we will review this roadway markings and make any appropriate alterations. And sure enough, about a couple months later, they repainted the parking spot and fixed this problem here in New York. Now these are local small issues, right? But let's apply this to the bigger issues, right? I'm doing it on this kind of data because that's what's out there. But imagine as more data comes online, the issues we can solve. Are we picking up our trash in the most efficient way? I don't know, because I've filed a bunch of Freedom of Information requests and I can't get the data out to know the route of the truck, like to know even the schedules. They're hidden behind a wall, right? There are basic questions that we all deserve to ask, and that's what open data allows us to do. And I'm going to end with the very last example, which is these pedestrian ramps. It turns out that in New York, and this is odd, but you actually can legally park in front of a pedestrian ramp in New York City because one of the city council members years back, had a lot of parking people and wanted to make them. And anyway, the idea is that if you have a pedestrian ramp but there's no crosswalk and no stop sign, it's a very unsafe place to cross the street, right? Because cars will just zoom by. So we should just let cars park. I get that part, but then, so we should let cars block them. That part I don't get, but all right, that's the law today in New York. And that's the way it is. And I parked in front of one of these once in my neighborhood, and I got a ticket. Okay, so I wrote, said, no, the law says this, and I lost. I said, okay, so I appealed, and I lost. And I said, well, this is getting a little weird. So I downloaded every parking ticket ever given to anyone in New York City, and I started going through the most popular places where people block, and I found that basically, in short, every single spot there was a legal parking spot. And the city realized that they were ticketing people $2 to $3 million a year for legally parked cars. Now what I did differently here is I notified the city in advance of me writing it. I gave them a 1-month heads up. I said, a month from now I'm going to tell everyone this. And this time something amazing happened. The New York Police Department put out a statement. Mr. Wellington analysis identified errors the department made in issuing summonses. It appears to be a misunderstanding by officers, so they're admitting a mistake, of an abstruse change in the parking law, so they blame the law. And then they went and they gave refunds, and they said they were going to retrain all their officers, right? So these are small wins, and to point out, by the way, this is not just because I'm a computer nerd. Here's an example of an urban planning student after their second day of class using Excel to start to plot accidents in their own neighborhoods, or even high school students taking this and making a map about graffiti around New York, right? This is accessible to all of us, and I just wanted to inspire that. So with that, I'm going to bring out our great panelists who are going to actually tell us the real science behind all this, and some exciting stories from government, from academia, and from nonprofits. So thank you.